The late afternoon sun cast golden hues over Oak Ridge, a quiet town where life moved at an unhurried pace. Officer Daniel Mercer guided his patrol car down Maple Avenue, his grip on the wheel tightening as memories pressed against the edges of his mind. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, a scent that always pulled him back to that day 5 years ago. "Daddy, look what I made." The echo of his daughter's voice rattled through his brain as vividly as if she had just spoken. Emily had been so proud of that little beaded bracelet, her tiny fingers carefully stringing pink and purple beads, securing a small silver heart charm in the center. The way the light had caught it, making it sparkle, he could still see it so clearly. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing his focus back to the road. The memories always came sharper in the fall, when the trees turned that same shade of fiery red as Emily's hair. 5 years. 5 years of searching, of chasing every whisper, of holding on to a hope that was just as painful as it was necessary. And still, no trace of his little girl. A silver sedan rolled through a stop sign ahead, pulling him out of his thoughts. Instinct took over. He flipped on his lights, the brief distraction a welcome relief. The vehicle pulled over smoothly, without hesitation. As Daniel stepped out, his years of experience guided his every move. He approached cautiously, his notepad in hand, the weight of routine settling over him. "License and registration, please," he said, leaning toward the driver's window. A woman looked up at him with an apologetic expression, her hands fumbling in her purse. "I'm so sorry, officer. I really thought I stopped." "It's okay, Mommy," a small voice chirped from the back seat. "Everyone makes mistakes sometimes." Daniel froze. His breath caught in his throat. The voice. It was so familiar, so heartbreakingly familiar. His gaze lifted, locking onto the rearview mirror. There, staring back at him, was a young girl, around 10 years old. Auburn hair neatly pulled into a ponytail, wide eyes filled with curiosity, his chest constricted. "Here you go, officer," the woman, Sarah Mitchell, according to the name on the license, said, handing over the documents. Daniel forced himself to glance at them, willing his hands to remain steady, but in his peripheral vision something caught his eye. A flicker of movement. The little girl, Clara, he heard her mother call her, was absent-mindedly playing with something on her wrist. A bracelet, pink and purple beads, a small silver heart charm glinting in the evening sun. His grip on the notepad faltered. That's a pretty bracelet you have there," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. Clara beamed at him. "Thank you. I found it at the park last week. Mom said if nobody claims it, I can keep it." The world tilted slightly. It couldn't be. The chances were impossible. But that bracelet, Daniel had helped Emily string those very beads himself. He had watched her tiny fingers work in concentration, had clasped it around her wrist the morning she disappeared. "Officer? Are you all right?" Sarah's voice brought him back. Daniel straightened, his years of training forcing him to maintain control. "Yes, ma'am," he said, handing back her documents. "Just a warning today. Please make a complete stop next time." Sarah exhaled in relief. "Thank you, officer. We will." Clara grinned at him. "Bye, officer." Daniel barely heard them. His eyes remained fixed on the bracelet as they drove away, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had seen hundreds of little girls over the years. Each one had been a painful reminder of Emily. But this, the bracelet, the hair, the voice, it was too much. It was impossible to ignore. Or was he finally losing his grip on reality? Back in his patrol car, he swallowed hard and picked up his phone. He hesitated only a moment before typing in Sarah Mitchell's information. A simple traffic stop had just shattered every wall he had built around his pain, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something far bigger was at play. Daniel's footsteps echoed hollowly as he stepped into his house that night, the quiet pressing in around him like a living thing. He tossed his keys onto the entryway table, but his gaze was already drawn down the dimly lit hallway. His feet carried him forward before he even made the conscious decision. The door at the end of the hall was closed, just as it always was. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment before he finally twisted it open. Emily's room. The air inside was thick with the weight of memory. The walls were still painted soft pink, the bed still neatly made with her favorite stuffed rabbit propped against the pillows. Time had stood still in this room. 5 years had passed outside, but here, everything remained untouched. Frozen. Daniel sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his fingers finding the familiar edges of the photo album resting on the nightstand. He flipped it open, and there she was, Emily, her smile wide and full of life, proudly holding up her wrist to display her bracelet, the same bracelet he had seen today. He sucked in a sharp breath, his heart hammering as he remembered the tiny engraving on the back of the silver charm. To E, love Dad. That engraving. That was the proof. If the bracelet Clara wore had the same words etched into it, then there was no denying it. It was Emily's. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the album tightly. His training as a cop told him to take a step back to follow the proper procedures. But the father in him, the father in him wanted to race to wherever that little girl was and check that bracelet himself. Instead, he forced himself to stand, to move to his home office where the glow of his computer screen bathed the room in cold light. He entered Sarah Mitchell's name into the police database. Her record was clean. Almost too clean. Driver's license issued 3 years ago in Cedar Grove. No previous addresses listed. No employment history. No paper trail. Frowning, Daniel dug deeper. Clara Mitchell. School records showed she had been homeschooled until this year. No birth certificate on file. No medical history. It was as if they had appeared out of thin air 3 years ago. His gut twisted. This doesn't make sense. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion seeping into his bones. Normal families had history, paper trails, documents, roots. Sarah and Clara had none of that. Daniel closed his eyes, his mind racing back over the years. The witness reports, the grainy gas station surveillance footage that had never given them enough to go on. A man with Emily, a dark jacket, a little girl in a pink sweater. The details had always been frustratingly vague, but now, his stomach churned. He turned back to the photo album, flipping to the next picture. Emily's bright eyes looked back at him, her wrist still proudly displaying that bracelet. It was identical. If Clara's bracelet had the engraving, then there was no question. His pulse pounded as he grabbed his coat and keys. He needed to see that bracelet again. The next morning, Daniel sat in his unmarked police car, parked discreetly across from the Cedar Grove Community Center. He had called in sick for the first time in 3 years, unable to focus on anything else. At precisely 9:45 a.m., Sarah's silver sedan pulled into the parking lot. Clara hopped out, her art portfolio clutched to her chest, her ponytail bouncing as she skipped toward the building. The way she moved, the way she tilted her head slightly when she concentrated, it was like watching Emily all over again. His throat tightened as he watched her through the large windows of the art studio. Clara settled at an easel, her small hands moving with a careful precision that sent a wave of emotion crashing over him. The door to the passenger side opened, and Sarah hesitated before stepping out. But instead of driving away like the other parents, she lingered, checking her phone, looking around, waiting for something or someone. 15 minutes passed before she finally left, driving to the local cafe, the Daily Grind. Daniel followed at a safe distance, keeping 3 cars between them. He watched as she took a seat at an outdoor table, her shoulders visibly tense. Within minutes, another woman arrived, Jenny Miller. Her daughter attended the same art classes as Clara. Daniel leaned forward slightly, watching through his rolled-down window. "It must have been hard moving here," Jenny said, stirring her coffee. "Leaving everything behind." Sarah forced a small smile. "It was necessary. Clara and I needed a fresh start after everything." "You never really said where you moved from," Jenny pressed gently. Sarah's smile faltered, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "Oh, You know, we moved around a lot. Sometimes it's better to leave the past in the past. Daniel's instincts went on high alert. He had conducted enough interviews, interrogated enough suspects to recognize the subtle signs of deception: the nervous fingers, the refusal to meet direct eye contact, the forced casual tone. Back at the community center, Daniel remained in his car, watching as Clara's art class wrapped up. She carefully packed away her supplies, chatting easily with the other kids. Another girl knocked over a cup of water, and Clara immediately jumped up to help, placing a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder. That small, natural act of kindness, it was exactly what Emily would have done. His heart ached. Sarah returned to pick up Clara, her posture tense, her eyes scanning the area as if expecting to see someone watching them. Daniel didn't move. He just sat there, watching them leave. Back at the station later that evening, Daniel found Officer Diana Ramos at her desk. She was one of the few people who had been with him through everything, from Emily's disappearance to the darkest nights when he thought he wouldn't survive the grief. "Diana," he said quietly, pulling out his phone. "I need your eyes on something." She looked up, concern flickering across her face. "What's going on?" He slid his phone across the desk, showing her two photos side by side. One of Emily wearing her bracelet. The other, a zoomed-in shot of Clara's wrist from the traffic stop. Diana frowned. "Luke, look at the charm," he interrupted. "It's the same design, the same engraving. I had it custom-made for Emily." She studied the images carefully. "Diana," his voice was raw, barely above a whisper. "What if this isn't a coincidence? What if she's—" She exhaled slowly, setting the phone down. "Luke, I know how much you want to find her, but grief, it makes us see things that aren't really there." His jaw tightened. "Then explain Sarah Mitchell. Explain why there's no paper trail for her and Clara before 3 years ago." Diana hesitated. "I need to look into the foster system," he pressed. "Clara's records say she was adopted. But what if that's not the whole story?" She leaned back, crossing her arms. "You're asking me to pull confidential records, Luke." "My daughter is worth more than any rule," he said quietly. Diana sighed, rubbing her temples. "Even if I wanted to help, I'd need probable cause. I'll find it," he promised. Back at his desk, he opened every old case file related to missing children, cross-referencing them with gaps in the foster system. Pages blurred together as midnight approached, but one detail refused to let him go: the second bracelet. He had never told anyone about the custom engraving, so how had Clara's bracelet ended up exactly the same? A cold chill settled over him. He wasn't letting this go. Not now. Not ever. The cold air seeped through the barely cracked window of Daniel's patrol car as he sat parked outside of Sarah Mitchell's modest house on Sycamore Lane. It was a quiet street, the kind of neighborhood where kids rode their bikes up and down the sidewalks without a care in the world, where porch lights flickered on at dusk, welcoming their families home. But Daniel knew better than to be fooled by peaceful exteriors. Secrets could be buried anywhere, and tonight he was determined to uncover them. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel as he watched the small, single-story house. The curtains were drawn tight, no movement visible from where he sat. His eyes flickered to the driveway. The silver sedan was parked out front, its hood still faintly warm from earlier that evening. They were home. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging up the windshield. He knew he was treading dangerous ground, surveillance without cause, following a civilian without a case file to back it up. These were the kind of things that could cost a man his badge. But every fiber of his being screamed that something wasn't right. That bracelet, that little girl, her voice, the way she moved, the way Sarah avoided answering questions, how her story didn't add up. If he was wrong, he would accept the consequences. But if he was right? If Clara wasn't really Sarah's daughter? If there was even the smallest chance that she was Emily? He had to know. The memory of Emily's disappearance was always lurking, just beneath the surface. 5 years ago, She had been walking home from school just 3 blocks away from their house. She had called him earlier that day, bubbling with excitement over a surprise she had made for him in art class. "It's special, Daddy. You'll see when I get home." But she never made it home. The call came in at 4:37 p.m. A neighbor had seen a girl matching Emily's description near the intersection of Willow and 5th, speaking to a man in a gray sedan. The witness had been vague, unsure of details, but Daniel had latched onto that single clue with everything he had. That lead had dried up like all the others. The security footage from a nearby gas station had captured a blurry figure with a child, but it had never been enough. Never enough to bring her back. Now, sitting in his car, he found himself gripping the steering wheel harder. The weight of it all sat heavy on his chest. He forced himself to breathe, to steady his thoughts. His job was to follow facts, not desperation. But how could he ignore what was right in front of him? His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He glanced down. A message from Diana. "Luke, you need to stop. This is dangerous territory. You don't have proof." His jaw clenched as he typed back. "I just need to be sure." He tossed the phone aside, running a hand through his hair. He needed to be careful. The last thing he could afford was scaring Sarah off before he had answers. He pulled out his notepad, flipping to the pages he had filled with frantic notes the night before. Details about Sarah, Clara, their timeline. The missing pieces that didn't make sense. If Sarah had adopted Clara, there had to be records, but there weren't. No adoption agency listed. No foster home prior to their sudden appearance in Cedar Grove. It was as if they had stepped out of thin air. Movement near the front door caught his eye. Sarah. She had turned off the porch light and was peeking through the blinds. Even in the dim glow from the street lamps, he could see the tension in her posture. She was looking for something. Or someone. Her gaze swept over the street before she hesitated, her shoulders stiffening. She had seen him. Daniel stayed perfectly still, barely breathing as she stared in his direction. Then, after a long moment, she turned away, stepping back from the window. The porch light flicked back on. A warning. Daniel exhaled, gripping the wheel. He had been made. He had pushed too hard, too soon. He reached for his keys. Staying here wasn't going to get him any more answers tonight. If anything, it might just spook her into running. He couldn't let that happen. He needed to be smart, methodical. Tomorrow, he would find another way. The next morning, Daniel sat at his desk, sifting through case files. He needed more than just a feeling, more than just a bracelet. He needed a connection, something that tied Sarah to a larger pattern. He started with missing children cases, the ones that had gaps, the ones where records didn't quite match up. His fingers paused over a report from 3 years ago. A child, 5 years old, disappeared from a small town 2 states over. The case had gone cold quickly. No witnesses, no leads. Then another, a 6-year-old, taken from a foster home under strange circumstances. The paperwork had been a mess, missing signatures, incorrect dates. Daniel's stomach twisted as he flipped through them. One by one, he found more. Children who had vanished, only to resurface in adoption records with new names, new lives. His breath hitched as realization dawned. This wasn't just about Emily. This was bigger. His phone rang, yanking him out of his thoughts. Diana. He hesitated before answering. "Yeah?" There was a long pause, then her voice, quiet but firm. "Luke, you need to come to the station. Now." Something in her tone sent a chill down his spine. He grabbed his coat and was out the door in seconds. When he arrived, Diana was waiting by her desk, a file in her hands. She didn't look up right away. "You were right," she finally said, pushing the file toward him. Daniel snatched it up, flipping it open. His stomach dropped. A birth certificate, a real one, for Clara Mitchell. Except that wasn't her name. The original document had a different name entirely. Emily Callahan. The room spun. He gripped the desk, barely able to process what he was seeing. "It was buried deep," Diana said softly. Took some digging. But this proves it. Daniel's breath came sharp and shallow. His hands shook as he traced the familiar name on the paper, his daughter's name. "She's alive," he whispered. Diana nodded. "And we're going to get her back." Everything that had been holding him together for the past 5 years came undone in that moment. The grief, the guilt, the exhaustion. It all crumbled away, replaced by something sharper. Determination. Sarah Mitchell had taken his daughter, and now he was going to take her back. The air in the small FBI command center was tense with anticipation. Multiple agents sat around the room, their eyes fixed on the surveillance screens showing the live feed from the truck stop where Victor Reeves was suspected to be. Luke stood at the center of it all, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he stared at the monitors. Every passing second made his heart pound harder. He had waited 5 years for this. Martinez was on the radio with the field team, his voice calm but firm. "All units, keep eyes on the main entrance. If he's here, we don't spook him. We wait for confirmation." Luke barely heard him. His entire focus was on scanning the screen, looking for that one familiar face. The image of the man with the snake tattoo was burned into his mind. He knew the moment he saw him, he wouldn't hesitate. Minutes dragged on, stretching into an unbearable silence. Then, one of the agents monitoring the cameras stiffened. "We have movement," she said. Luke's heart slammed against his ribs. He leaned in. A man had stepped out of a black pickup truck, wearing a dark jacket, the collar turned up against the cold night air. His hands were in his pockets, his posture casual but deliberate. The agent zoomed in on the grainy footage. The moment Luke saw the tattoo peeking from the edge of the man's collar, his breath caught. "It's him," Luke whispered. "That's Victor Reeves." Martinez spoke into his radio. "Stand by for confirmation. Do not move in until we have a visual on his contacts." Luke's hands curled into fists. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to act. He had spent too many years waiting. He couldn't let this moment slip away. Victor walked toward the diner attached to the truck stop, pausing briefly to glance over his shoulder before disappearing inside. One of the undercover agents stationed at the counter inside tapped his hidden earpiece. He just ordered coffee, keeping eyes on him. "Any sign of an accomplice?" Martinez asked. "Not yet." Luke was already moving toward the door. Martinez caught his arm. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" "I'm going in," Luke said through gritted teeth. "No, you're not," Martinez snapped. "You're emotionally compromised and we're not taking any chances. You want to help? You stay here and let us do our job." Luke's pulse thundered in his ears. Every muscle in his body was wound tight. He was so close. Too close to sit back and do nothing. Then, through the radio, the agent inside the diner spoke again. "He's making a call." Luke stiffened. The feed from inside the diner zoomed in slightly. Victor leaned against the counter, stirring his coffee as he held the phone to his ear. Luke could barely breathe as he watched. Then Victor spoke, and every word made Luke's blood run cold. "Yeah," Victor said casually. "We got a problem. Someone's been asking about the girl. Looks like we're gonna have to handle it." Luke's hands clenched into fists. Victor Reeves knew, and that meant Sarah and Clara weren't safe. Luke turned sharply toward Martinez. "We need to move. Now." Martinez hesitated only a second before nodding. He grabbed the radio. "All units, stand by for takedown. Move in now." Within seconds, the field agents were mobilizing. Luke watched as they approached the diner, their movements precise, practiced. He held his breath as they entered. There was a brief scuffle, a commotion. Then, the confirmation over the radio. "Suspect in custody." Luke's knees nearly buckled. It was over. Or at least, this part was. Because now Victor would have to talk. Luke didn't wait. He was already out the door, heading for the car that would take Victor to the station. Martinez followed, calling after him. "Luke, don't do anything stupid." Luke didn't respond. His entire focus was locked on one thought: getting answers. An hour later, Luke stood outside the interrogation room, staring through the two-way mirror at the man he had been chasing for half a decade. Victor sat calmly in his chair, his cuffs resting on the table in front of him. His expression was unreadable. He looked almost bored. Luke had seen monsters before. He had arrested killers, traffickers, abusers. But none of them had ever made his stomach turn the way this man did. Diana appeared beside him. "Martinez says they're letting you take the lead." Luke exhaled sharply, straightened his posture, and pushed the door open. Victor looked up as Luke entered, his mouth curling into a slow, lazy smirk. "Ah, the grieving father. I was wondering when they'd send you in." Luke pulled out a chair and sat across from him, keeping his expression unreadable. "You know why you're here?" Victor shrugged. "Do I?" Luke placed a single photograph on the table. Emily. Victor's smirk faded just slightly. Luke leaned forward. "Where is she?" Victor studied him for a long moment, then let out a quiet chuckle. "You still think she's out there, don't you?" Luke's entire body went rigid. Victor tilted his head. "That's the thing about hope. It makes you blind." Luke slammed his hands on the table, making Victor flinch slightly. "Tell me where she is." Victor sighed, shaking his head. "I don't know." "Bullshit." Victor glanced at the mirror, then back at Luke. "You can search every file, every case. You won't find her, not the way you want to." Luke's pulse pounded. He wanted to lunge across the table. He wanted to break the smirk off this man's face, but he forced himself to breathe, to stay in control. Instead, he pulled out another photo, this time of Clara. Victor's expression changed. Luke leaned in. "I know she was one of yours. I know what you did." Victor's jaw tightened. "Tell me what happened to Emily," Luke demanded, "or I swear I will make sure you never see daylight again." Victor exhaled slowly. Then, finally, he spoke. "She was supposed to disappear," he said simply. "But things got complicated." Luke's breath caught. Victor tapped his fingers on the table, considering his next words. "We don't usually keep them that long, but she was different. Someone wanted her. Someone important." Luke felt sick. "Who?" Victor just smiled. "You're asking the wrong questions, Officer Callahan." Luke slammed his fist down again. "Who took her?" Victor leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Let's make a deal." Luke's stomach twisted. Victor's eyes gleamed with something sinister. "You want your daughter back? Then you're going to do exactly what I say." Luke's entire body tensed. He had come here looking for answers. But what Victor had just given him was something far worse. Because now, Luke knew the truth. Emily was still alive. And she was still out there. Luke stared at Victor, his entire body rigid with tension. The words hung between them, thick with implication. Emily was still alive. It was the only thing that mattered, the only thing keeping him from slamming his fists into the man's smug face. His breath came slow and controlled, but inside everything in him screamed for action. "You're lying," Luke said, his voice low, dangerous. Victor smirked. "You think I'd waste my time lying about something like this? I know exactly where she is." Luke's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Every fiber of his being told him to drag the truth out of Victor by force, but that wasn't going to work. He needed him to talk. He needed him to slip up. "If you know where she is, tell me," Luke said, his voice steady despite the rage boiling beneath the surface. Victor leaned back in his chair, tilting his head as he studied Luke. "It's not that simple. People like me, we don't give things away for free." Luke exhaled sharply. "You want something." Victor's smile widened. "I always want something." Luke didn't blink. "And what is it?" Victor tapped his fingers against the metal table, considering. "A deal. I tell you what I know, and in return, I walk out of here." Luke let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You really think that's going to happen?" Victor's expression didn't change. You want your daughter back, Officer Callahan? Then you're going to have to make a choice. Luke felt his pulse hammering in his ears. He wanted to lunge across the table, to rip the truth from Victor's throat, but he forced himself to stay still. He had to be smart. You know I can't make that deal, Luke said finally. Victor shrugged. Then I guess she stays lost. Luke pushed back from the table abruptly, standing so fast the chair scraped against the floor. He turned, pacing the small room, breathing through his fury. Diana's voice crackled in his earpiece. Luke, step out. He didn't move. His hands pressed flat against the cold surface of the table as he leaned in toward Victor. You can sit here all night and play games, but sooner or later you're going to realize something. You don't control this situation. I do. Victor smirked. Then why do you look so desperate? Luke straightened and turned without another word, yanking the door open and stepping into the hallway. Diana was waiting, arms crossed, her expression tight. You need to cool off, she said. He's baiting you, and you're letting him win. Luke's jaw clenched. He's got information. I know, Diana said, but if you lose control, we lose our chance to get it. Luke dragged a hand down his face. I don't have time for this, Diana. Emily is out there. Diana sighed. And we're going to find her, but not by making a deal with a monster. Luke exhaled slowly. He knew she was right, but waiting, holding back, it felt impossible. Martinez approached, holding a thick file. We're working another angle, he said. While you were in there, we pulled Reeves's financials, traced his burner phones, ran through every property tied to him in the last 5 years. He's been careful, but nobody's perfect. Luke snapped to attention. And? Martinez handed him the file. He's been making payments to an offshore account under an alias, but one of our analysts found a link. 3 months ago, he wired a large sum of money to a private address just outside of Denver. Luke flipped through the file, scanning the address. His heart pounded. Whose name is on the deed? Martinez hesitated. It's under a shell corporation, but we ran the tax records and it looks like someone's been living there. A woman. Luke's grip tightened on the folder. Who? Martinez sighed. We don't know yet, but we're sending a team to check it out. Luke's stomach twisted. It wasn't enough. He needed more. Diana placed a hand on his arm. Luke, we'll get her. Luke exhaled sharply and nodded. Hours later, Luke sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked SUV, staring at the Denver property from a distance. The house was nestled at the end of a quiet road, surrounded by trees. It looked ordinary, but Luke knew better. Martinez was in the driver's seat speaking into his radio. Surveillance teams are in place. No sign of movement inside yet. Luke's grip tightened on his gun. His mind raced with possibilities. Was Emily inside? Was she safe? Would she even remember him? A quiet knock on the SUV's window made him turn. An agent leaned down. Lights just came on inside. We have movement. Luke's heart pounded as he grabbed his earpiece. We go in now. Martinez hesitated. Luke was already reaching for the door. A moment later, agents were surrounding the house. Luke's gun was drawn, his hands steady despite the storm raging inside him. Martinez gave the signal and the front door was breached. Luke entered first. The air inside was stale, the furniture sparse. A single lamp flickered in the corner. Then he saw her. A woman stood in the center of the living room, her hands raised in surrender. Her face was lined with worry, her eyes wide with shock. Don't shoot, she said quickly. Luke's gun stayed trained on her. Who are you? The woman swallowed hard. My name is Rebecca Holt. Luke's eyes narrowed. Why are you here? Rebecca hesitated. I was paid to take care of her. Luke's blood turned to ice. Take care of who? He demanded. Rebecca's eyes darted to a closed door at the back of the room. Luke's breath caught. He turned toward the door, his heart hammering as he reached for the handle. He pushed it open, and there she was. A girl sat curled on the small bed, her back pressed against the wall. Her hair was longer, her frame thinner, but Luke would have recognized her anywhere. Emily. His breath hitched. She stared at him, wide-eyed, frozen in place. Luke's gun slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor. Emily? His voice broke on the name. She flinched. Luke felt his knees go weak. He wanted to rush to her, to pull her into his arms, but he forced himself to stay still. "It's okay," he whispered. "It's me. Daddy's here." Emily didn't move. Luke's heart shattered. Rebecca shifted behind him. "She doesn't remember," she said softly. "She's been told you're dead." Luke's chest tightened. Emily's lips parted slightly, her eyes darting between him and the door. "Baby." Luke tried again, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's really me." Emily swallowed hard. Then slowly she reached for her wrist. Luke's breath caught as he saw it. The bracelet. Still there? Still the same. His vision blurred with tears. Emily hesitated. Then, with shaky fingers, she turned the silver heart charm over. Luke saw the engraving, and in that moment, everything else disappeared. Because even though she didn't speak, even though she didn't move, Luke saw it in her eyes. Recognition. A single tear slipped down Emily's cheek, and then finally, in a voice so small he almost didn't hear it, she whispered the word that broke him completely. "Daddy?" Luke's breath hitched as the word left Emily's lips. It was barely a whisper, so soft that for a moment he thought he might have imagined it. But then he saw the way her fingers trembled against the bracelet, the way her wide eyes darted between him and the door like a frightened animal trapped in a corner. The room was silent except for the rapid pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. He wanted to move, to step forward, to wrap her in his arms and never let go, but he forced himself to stay still. Any sudden movement might shatter the fragile thread connecting them in this moment. "Yeah, sweetheart," Luke whispered, his voice breaking. "It's me." Emily's lip trembled. Her body was coiled tight, poised to flee, but her fingers stayed on the bracelet, gripping it so hard her knuckles went white. Luke couldn't breathe. He had spent 5 years imagining this moment, picturing it over and over in his mind, but nothing could have prepared him for the way his little girl, his baby, looked at him now, like he was both a stranger and someone she had spent her whole life searching for. Rebecca Holt shifted behind him, her presence a quiet reminder that they weren't alone. Luke barely spared her a glance. His entire focus was on Emily. "You don't have to be scared," he said softly, willing his voice to stay steady. "I'm here now. No one is ever going to hurt you again." Emily didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. That was something. It was enough. Martinez's voice crackled in Luke's earpiece. "House is clear. We need to move." Luke exhaled, his hands shaking as he lowered himself to his knees to be at eye level with Emily. He needed to get her out of here, away from this house, away from the memories that might still hold her prisoner. But more than anything, he needed her to trust him. "Emily," he said again, slower this time. "I know this is scary, but I promise you, I won't let anything bad happen to you. Will you come with me?" Her fingers tightened around the bracelet, her breath coming fast and shallow. Luke could see the conflict in her eyes, the fear and the doubt. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she gave the smallest nod. Luke's eyes burned as he swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Okay, sweetheart, let's go home." Rebecca let out a slow, shaky breath behind him. "She doesn't talk much," she murmured. "Not anymore. I don't know what they did to her before she got here, but—" Luke cut her off with a sharp look. "We'll talk later. Right now, I need to get her out of here." Martinez reappeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We have a team standing by. We'll take her back to a secure location until we sort everything out." Luke nodded, but his stomach twisted at the thought of handing Emily over to anyone else. He had just found her. The idea of letting her out of his sight again made his entire body tense, But this wasn't about what he wanted. It was about what was best for her. "She comes with me," Luke said firmly. Martinez hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But we do this carefully. We don't know how deep this operation goes yet." Luke turned back to Emily, his heart aching at how small she looked, how fragile. "Can I carry you?" Emily hesitated. Then, in a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible, she reached out. Luke moved slowly, giving her time to pull back, but she didn't. As he scooped her up, the weight of her in his arms nearly broke him. She was so light. Too light. But she was here. She was real. And for the first time in 5 years, Luke Callahan felt like he could breathe again. They moved quickly, exiting the house with FBI agents covering every angle. The night air was cold, but Luke barely felt it. He kept his eyes straight ahead, holding Emily close as he climbed into the SUV. She clung to his jacket, her fingers still gripping the bracelet like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. The drive back to Cedar Grove was quiet. Emily didn't speak, didn't ask where they were going. She just stared out the window, her small hands tucked into her lap. Luke kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, his mind racing with everything he wanted to say, but the words felt too big, too heavy. Diana's voice came through his radio. "Sarah and Clara are asking about you." Luke exhaled. He had almost forgotten about them in the chaos of finding Emily. Clara. His heart squeezed at the thought of her. How was she going to process this? How was Sarah? "I'll bring her in soon," Luke said into the radio. I need a minute." Diana's voice softened. "Take your time, Luke." This is big. Luke turned to Emily. "Hey, sweetheart. We're going to a safe place, okay? Somewhere warm, somewhere quiet. You don't have to do anything. Just rest." Emily blinked at him, her expression unreadable. But she didn't look away. That was enough for now. Back in Cedar Grove, Sarah paced the length of her living room, her fingers curled into fists. Clara sat on the couch, silent, her knees pulled up to her chest. She hadn't spoken much since Luke had left. "Mom," Clara said finally. "Is she coming here?" Sarah stilled. "I don't know, honey." Clara bit her lip. "If she is, does that mean I have to leave?" Sarah's heart clenched. She dropped to her knees in front of Clara, cupping her face. "Number absolutely not. You're my daughter, no matter what happens, that won't change." Clara hesitated, then whispered, "But I'm not really yours." Tears burned in Sarah's eyes. "Yes, you are," she said fiercely. "You are mine, Clara. I love you. That's never going to change." Clara looked away, her fingers tracing the bracelet on her wrist. What if she remembers? Sarah didn't have an answer for that. The sound of a car pulling up outside made them both freeze. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the door. Clara whispered, "She's here, isn't she?" Sarah nodded slowly, her heart pounding. "I think so." The front door opened. Luke stepped inside, and in his arms was a little girl with red hair, her face pale, her eyes wide and uncertain. Emily. Sarah's breath caught. Clara's fingers tightened around her bracelet. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Clara stood up slowly, her gaze locked onto Emily's. Emily blinked at her. And then, in a voice so small it was barely there, Emily whispered, "I know you." Clara's breath hitched. Her fingers traced the bracelet again. Luke's heart ached as he watched the two girls staring at each other, two lives entangled in ways neither of them fully understood yet. Emily reached for her own bracelet, gripping it tight. "I had one just like that," she murmured. Clara swallowed hard. I think this used to be yours." Silence filled the room, thick with emotion. Then, for the first time since Luke had found her, Emily's lips parted into something that almost resembled a smile. And Luke knew, in that moment, that everything had changed. Luke felt his entire world shift as Emily's voice broke through the silence. The single word, barely above a whisper, shattered every wall he had built around his pain. His knees nearly buckled beneath him, but he held himself steady, forcing his body to stay still, his hands open and empty. The last thing he wanted to do was scare her. His daughter, his little girl. After 5 years, she was right in front of him. But she was fragile, like a deer caught in headlights, frozen between recognition and fear. His throat tightened as he fought against the wave of emotions threatening to pull him under. "It's me, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice cracking. "I'm here." Emily didn't move. She clutched her bracelet so tightly her knuckles turned white, her fingers trembling over the tiny silver heart charm. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Luke took the smallest step forward, but the moment he did, she flinched, pressing herself harder against the wall. His heart clenched. She was afraid of him. The realization was like a knife to his chest, twisting deeper with every second of silence between them. Behind him, Rebecca shifted, her gaze darting nervously between them. She doesn't understand," she whispered. "She's been told things, that her family didn't want her, that she was abandoned." Luke's jaw clenched. "Who told her that?" Rebecca hesitated, looking away. "Victor, and others. They made sure she never asked questions, that she never thought about where she came from." Luke's fists tightened at his sides, his breath coming sharp and shallow. He wanted to break something, to unleash all the rage and pain and grief he had been carrying for years. But none of that would help Emily. Right now, she needed him to be calm, to be steady. "Emily," he said again, softer this time. "I know you're scared. I know you don't understand what's happening. But I promise you, I am your father. I have never stopped looking for you." Her fingers curled even tighter around the bracelet. They said you were gone." Her voice was hoarse, uncertain, as if speaking the words made her question them. "I'm not," Luke said, swallowing against the lump in his throat. "I'm right here, sweetheart. I never stopped loving you. I never stopped searching." A tear slipped down Emily's cheek. She reached up to wipe it away quickly, as if she had been taught that crying was wrong. Luke's heart broke all over again. What had she been through? What had they done to her? "She doesn't trust anyone," Rebecca said quietly. "Not easily. She's been conditioned to believe that love is a weakness." Luke closed his eyes for a brief moment, forcing down the burning anger inside him. He opened them again and focused on Emily. "I know this is a lot," he said, "and I know you don't have a reason to believe me yet. But you still have your bracelet. Do you remember who gave it to you?" Emily looked down at her wrist, staring at the familiar beads, the silver heart. Slowly, she turned it over again, running her fingers over the engraving. "To E. Love, Dad." Luke watched as her breathing grew uneven, her body trembling with something unspoken. The memories, were they coming back? Did she remember him, even if just a little? Rebecca took a careful step forward, speaking softly. "Emily, you told me once that you dreamed of a man with warm hands who used to hold yours when you were scared, that you remembered a voice singing to you at night. Do you think it might have been him?" Emily's gaze flickered toward Luke, hesitant, unsure. But there was something there, a flicker of recognition, a tiny, fragile crack in the wall she had built around herself. Luke took a slow breath. "I used to sing to you before bed," he said. "Every night. And when you had nightmares, I held your hand until you fell asleep again." Emily's fingers twitched. The song was about stars. Luke's chest tightened. "Yes. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. That was your favorite." Emily blinked rapidly, as if trying to push the memory away. She shook her head, hugging herself tightly. "Number no, they said." She cut herself off, breathing heavily. "They said you weren't real." Luke's heart ached. He wanted to hold her, to comfort her, to erase every horrible thing that had been done to her. But he couldn't force this. She had to come to him on her own. "They lied to you, sweetheart," he said, his voice filled with quiet pain. "But I swear to you, I am real, and I will never let them hurt you again." Emily's lip trembled. Her wide, fearful eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, he saw it. The little girl he had lost. The child who had once run into his arms without hesitation. The daughter he had spent every waking moment searching for. Then, without warning, she bolted. Luke barely had time to react before Emily scrambled off the bed, shoving past Rebecca and running toward the door. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Emily, wait!" She didn't stop. Luke followed, his movements careful, controlled. He couldn't chase her. She had spent too long being hunted, too long feeling trapped. She ran down the short hallway, but instead of going for the front door, she veered sharply to the right, slipping into another room. Luke followed cautiously, stepping inside. It was a small, dark space, a closet. Emily had wedged herself into the farthest corner, curling into a ball, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was trembling, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "It's me, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice cracking. "I'm here." Emily didn't move. She clutched her bracelet so tightly her knuckles turned white, her fingers trembling over the tiny silver heart charm. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Luke took the smallest step forward, but the moment he did, she flinched, pressing herself harder against the wall. His heart clenched. She was afraid of him. The realization was like a knife to his chest, twisting deeper with every second of silence between them. Behind him, Rebecca shifted, her gaze darting nervously between them. She doesn't understand," she whispered. "She's been told things. That her family didn't want her. That she was abandoned." Luke's jaw clenched. "Who told her that?" Rebecca hesitated, looking away. "Victor, and others. They made sure she never asked questions, that she never thought about where she came from." Luke's fists tightened at his sides, his breath coming sharp and shallow. He wanted to break something, to unleash all the rage and pain and grief he had been carrying for years. But none of that would help Emily. Right now, she needed him to be calm, to be steady. "Emily," he said again, softer this time. "I know you're scared. I know you don't understand what's happening. But I promise you, I am your father. I have never stopped looking for you." Her fingers curled even tighter around the bracelet. They said you were gone." Her voice was hoarse, uncertain, as if speaking the words made her question them. "I'm not," Luke said, swallowing against the lump in his throat. "I'm right here, sweetheart. I never stopped loving you. I never stopped searching." A tear slipped down Emily's cheek. She reached up to wipe it away quickly, as if she had been taught that crying was wrong. Luke's heart broke all over again. What had she been through? What had they done to her? "She doesn't trust anyone," Rebecca said quietly. "Not easily. She's been conditioned to believe that love is a weakness." Luke closed his eyes for a brief moment, forcing down the burning anger inside him. He opened them again and focused on Emily. "I know this is a lot," he said, "and I know you don't have a reason to believe me yet, but you still have your bracelet. Do you remember who gave it to you?" Emily looked down at her wrist, staring at the familiar beads, the silver heart. Slowly, she turned it over again, running her fingers over the engraving. "To E. Love, Dad." Luke watched as her breathing grew uneven, her body trembling with something unspoken. The memories, were they coming back? Did she remember him, even if just a little? Rebecca took a careful step forward, speaking softly. "Emily, you told me once that you dreamed of a man with warm hands who used to hold yours when you were scared, that you remembered a voice singing to you at night. Do you think it might have been him?" Emily's gaze flickered toward Luke, hesitant, unsure. But there was something there, a flicker of recognition, a tiny, fragile crack in the wall she had built around herself. Luke took a slow breath. "I used to sing to you before bed," he said. "Every night. And when you had nightmares, I held your hand until you fell asleep again." Emily's fingers twitched. The song was about stars. Luke's chest tightened. "Yes. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. That was your favorite." Emily blinked rapidly as if trying to push the memory away. She shook her head, hugging herself tightly. "Number no," they said. She cut herself off, breathing heavily. "They said you weren't real." Luke's heart ached. He wanted to hold her, to comfort her, to erase every horrible thing that had been done to her. But he couldn't force this. She had to come to him on her own. "They lied to you, sweetheart," he said, his voice filled with quiet pain. "But I swear to you I am real, and I will never let them hurt you again." Emily's lip trembled. Her wide, fearful eyes locked onto his. And for a moment, he saw it. The little girl he had lost. The child who had once run into his arms without hesitation. The daughter he had spent every waking moment searching for. Then, without warning, she bolted. Luke barely had time to react before Emily scrambled off the bed, shoving past Rebecca and running toward the door. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Emily, wait!" She didn't stop. Luke followed, his movements careful, controlled. He couldn't chase her. She had spent too long being hunted, too long feeling trapped. She ran down the short hallway, but instead of going for the front door, she veered sharply to the right, slipping into another room. Luke followed cautiously, stepping inside. It was a small, dark space, a closet. Emily had wedged herself into the farthest corner, curling into a ball, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was trembling, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Luke felt his heart break all over again. He crouched down, keeping his distance. "Sweetheart, you don't have to hide." Emily pressed her face into her arms. "I don't know what's real." Luke swallowed hard. "I know, baby, and that's okay. We'll figure it out together." A small sob escaped her, muffled against her sleeve. Luke reached into his pocket and pulled out something he had carried with him every day for the last 5 years. A small, worn Polaroid. "I want to show you something," he said gently. Emily didn't move. Luke carefully slid the photo across the floor, stopping just in front of her. "It's us. From your 5th birthday." There was a long, aching silence. Then, slowly, Emily lifted her head. She stared at the photo, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to pick it up but was afraid to. Luke's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you remember that day?" Emily's lips parted. Her fingers finally moved, hesitantly tracing the edges of the Polaroid. Luke held his breath. Then, in a voice so small he almost missed it, she whispered, "I had a pink dress." Luke felt the air rush from his lungs. His eyes burned with unshed tears. "Yes, sweetheart," he choked out. "You did." Emily's fingers gripped the photo tightly. She looked up at him, her expression wavering between fear and longing. Then, finally, she said the words that shattered him completely. "You didn't stop looking for me?" Luke's voice broke. "Never." A single tear slipped down Emily's cheek. She hesitated for only a second longer. Then, with a soft, broken sob, she launched herself forward. Luke caught her. His arms wrapped around her small frame, holding her as tightly as he dared. He felt her tiny hands clutching at his shirt, her body shaking as she cried against his chest. He pressed his face into her hair, his own tears falling freely now. "I've got you, baby," he whispered. "You're safe now. You're safe." And for the first time in 5 years, he truly believed it. Luke sat on the porch, watching the fading sunlight cast golden hues across the backyard. Emily and Clara were sprawled out on a blanket beneath the old oak tree, colored pencils scattered between them as they worked on a shared drawing. Their laughter drifted through the warm summer air, blending with the distant chirping of crickets. It was the kind of evening he once thought he'd never have again. The kind of peace he had convinced himself was lost forever. Sarah stepped onto the porch, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She handed one to Luke before settling into the chair beside him. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the girls. Clara gestured animatedly as she explained something to Emily, who nodded, her pencil moving swiftly across the page. "She's healing," Sarah said softly. "Faster than I expected." Luke nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "She still has nightmares," he admitted, "but they're less frequent now." Sarah sighed. "It'll take time." Luke's gaze never left Emily. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But at least she has that time now." The sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. Diana walked up the porch steps, holding a thick folder under her arm. Her expression was unreadable, but the way she gripped the folder told Luke she had news. He stood immediately. "What is it?" Diana exhaled slowly. "The final forensic report on Victor's operation. The FBI finished decoding the last of his records." Luke took the folder, flipping through the pages with steady hands. As he skimmed the neatly typed reports, his stomach twisted. Names, dates, transaction logs. "It's worse than we thought," Diana said grimly. "His network was bigger, more organized. We've identified several more children who went through his system." Luke clenched his jaw. "And Emily?" Diana hesitated. "She was marked as a special order, just like Agnes Winters said, but—" She took a deep breath. "Victor had help, high-level help." Luke's grip on the folder tightened. "Who?" Diana pointed to a page near the back of the report. "Recognize that name." Luke's eyes scanned the document, and the moment he saw it, his blood ran cold. Richard Callahan. His own brother. The words blurred before his eyes as his mind struggled to process what he was reading. His brother, his own flesh and blood, had been involved in Victor's operation. Number it couldn't be. "What the hell is this?" Luke's voice was low, dangerous. Diana's face was filled with sympathy. "I didn't want to believe it either, but the financial records don't lie. Richard's offshore accounts match payments traced back to Victor's shell companies." Luke felt like he had been punched in the gut. His brother had always been distant, more concerned with business deals and high society than family. But this? "He funded Victor's operation?" Luke forced the words out, still unable to believe what he was reading. "Not directly," Diana said, "but he was laundering money through his firm. Whether he knew exactly what he was involved in or not, he was benefiting from it." Luke's hands trembled. He had spent 5 years searching for Emily, 5 years blaming himself, thinking he had failed her, and all this time the answer had been so much closer than he ever imagined. Diana hesitated before adding, "We have enough to bring him in, Luke. But I need to know, how do you want to handle this?" Luke let out a slow breath, steadying himself. There was no choice. "We do it by the book," he said, his voice cold. "He answers for what he's done." Diana nodded. "We'll set up surveillance. Make sure we don't spook him before we're ready." Luke clenched his fists. He had been ready for this fight for 5 years. The next morning, Luke sat at his desk, staring at the arrest warrant for Richard Callahan. He had signed his name at the bottom, his signature steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. He glanced up as Agent Martinez approached. "We've tracked his movements," she said. "He's flying back from Miami tonight. We'll pick him up as soon as he lands." Luke nodded. He had spent countless nights imagining the moment he'd find the person responsible for taking Emily. He just never thought it would be his own blood. Across town, Sarah and Clara sat at the kitchen table, going over adoption paperwork. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she traced her fingers over the documents. "This means I'll really be yours?" she asked hesitantly. Sarah's heart swelled. "You've always been mine, sweetheart. This just makes it official." Clara bit her lip. "What if someone tries to take me away?" Sarah reached across the table, gently cupping Clara's face. "No one is taking you from me. Ever." Clara's eyes shone with tears, but this time they weren't from fear. She threw herself into Sarah's arms, clutching her tightly. Luke arrived just as Sarah was signing the final document. He watched the scene unfold, his heart full. After so much darkness, this was the kind of moment that made everything worth it. Later that night, Luke stood outside the airport, watching as Richard Callahan stepped off his private jet. The FBI agents surrounding him moved in smoothly, their badges flashing in the dim light. Richard barely had time to react before he was in handcuffs. "This is a mistake," he protested, his voice calm but firm. "You're making a mistake." Luke stepped forward, locking eyes with his brother. "No, Richard. The mistake was thinking you could get away with it." For the first time, Richard's mask slipped. His eyes narrowed. "You think you know everything, don't you?" Luke leaned in, his voice a whisper. "I know enough." Richard smirked. "Then you know this isn't over." Luke watched as the agents led him away, his heart pounding. No, this wasn't over. But for the first time, he felt like he was truly on the right path. Days later, Emily sat on the porch, sketching in her notebook. Clara sat beside her, humming softly as she colored. Luke stepped outside, a warm breeze ruffling his hair. "What are you two up to?" Emily glanced up, a soft smile on her lips. "Drawing a new beginning?" Luke's throat tightened. He crouched beside her, looking at the sketch. It was a picture of a house, their house, and in front of it stood 3 figures: a father, a daughter, and a sister. Luke swallowed hard. "It's perfect." Clara grinned. "We thought so too." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Luke wrapped his arms around both girls, holding them close. For the first time in 5 years, the weight on his heart began to lift. Emily was home. Clara was safe. And their family was finally whole. Luke stood outside the courthouse, the crisp autumn air sharp against his skin. The weight of the past few months pressed heavily on his shoulders as he watched the city wake up around him. The trial was set to begin today. Richard Callahan, his own brother, would finally face justice. He ran a hand over his face, trying to shake off the exhaustion that clung to him like a second skin. It had been weeks of preparation, of reliving every painful detail of Emily's disappearance, of tracing every financial transaction that linked Richard to Victor's operation. Now, the world would finally hear the truth. Agent Martinez approached from the sidewalk, a coffee in each hand. She handed one to Luke without a word, watching him carefully. "How are you holding up?" Luke let out a slow breath, staring at the courthouse steps. "I honestly don't know." Martinez sighed. "You've done everything right, Luke. We have the evidence. We have witnesses. This is open and shut." Luke nodded, but a part of him couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in his gut. His brother was powerful. Connections like his didn't disappear overnight. Even in handcuffs, Richard still carried himself like a man in control. Sarah and Clara arrived a few minutes later. Clara was holding Emily's hand, her grip protective. Emily had insisted on coming today. She wanted to see this through, even though Luke had offered her every excuse not to. "Are you sure you want to be here for this?" Luke asked gently, crouching down to Emily's eye level. Emily's fingers tightened around the bracelet on her wrist, her eyes full of quiet determination. "He helped take me away from you," she said. "I want to see him answer for it." Luke swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Okay." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Reporters lined the gallery, eager to cover the high-profile trial of a prominent businessman turned accused criminal. Luke sat at the prosecution's table, his hands folded tightly in front of him. Across the room, Richard was led to his seat, wearing an expensive suit despite the prison-issued shackles around his wrists. He didn't look at Luke, but a small, knowing smirk played at the corner of his lips. The trial began with opening arguments, the prosecution laying out a compelling case of financial records, witness testimonies, and Victor's own statements tying Richard directly to the trafficking operation. Then came the defense. Richard's lawyer was sharp, methodical, and ruthless. He painted Richard as an unwitting participant, someone who had unknowingly laundered money but had no direct involvement in Victor's crimes. Then, to Luke's horror, the lawyer turned his sights on Emily. "She was missing for 5 years," he said, pacing in front of the jury. "Can we truly be certain she remembers everything correctly? Trauma, as we know, can distort memory." Luke's fists clenched. Emily was sitting beside Sarah, her small frame tense. Clara placed a reassuring hand on her knee. "She knows what happened to her," Luke growled under his breath. Diana, sitting beside him, placed a calming hand on his arm. "Stay focused." The trial stretched on for days. The prosecution presented irrefutable evidence, but Richard's defense team fought back with everything they had. The courtroom became a battlefield of legal maneuvering, but through it all, Luke never took his eyes off his brother. Then, the moment of truth came. Emily took the stand. Luke's heart pounded as she walked up, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. The prosecutor approached her carefully. "Emily, can you tell us about the day you were taken?" Emily nodded, her voice soft but steady. "I was walking home from school. A man in a dark car pulled up beside me. He said he knew my dad, that he was a friend." Her small hands clenched in her lap. "I believed him." Luke felt sick. He had never heard her recount the story in this much detail before. The prosecutor nodded. "And do you remember where they took you?" Emily hesitated. "It was a long drive. I don't remember the place, just that it was far from home. There were other kids there." The prosecutor carefully handed her a photograph. "Do you recognize this man?" Emily looked at it. Victor's mugshot. A flicker of fear crossed her face, but she nodded. "That's him." The prosecutor then handed her another photo. "And do you recognize this one?" Emily froze. It was a picture of Richard. Tears welled in her eyes. Her breathing became shallow, panic flickering behind them. Sarah immediately stood, but Emily held up a hand, signaling that she wanted to continue. "He came to the place where we were kept," she whispered. "I saw him talking to Victor. He gave him something in an envelope." Luke's entire body went cold. He had suspected it, had seen the records, but hearing Emily confirm that his brother had stood face to face with the man who took her, it shattered something inside him. The courtroom was silent. The jury watched, their expressions unreadable. Richard's lawyer stood. "Emily," he said smoothly, "you were very young when this happened and you've been through quite a lot. Is it possible you're misremembering things?" Emily's jaw tightened. "No." The lawyer stepped closer. "Are you sure?" Emily's lip trembled, but then Clara's voice rang out from the gallery. "She remembers," she said firmly, "just like I remember." The judge banged his gavel. "Young lady, you cannot speak unless called to the stand." Clara quickly sat back, but her words had already settled in the room. Emily took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "I remember," she repeated, looking directly at Richard for the first time. "I know what you did." Luke watched his brother carefully. For the first time, Richard's expression cracked. Days later, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. The breath Luke had been holding for 5 years finally escaped him. Sarah squeezed his hand. Clara threw her arms around Emily. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, but Luke just sat there staring at his brother. Richard turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "You think this fixes everything?" he said as the guards led him away. "You'll never be free of this." Luke met his gaze head-on. "Neither will you." Months passed. Life settled into a new normal. Emily started school again, with Clara by her side every step of the way. Sarah finalized Clara's legal adoption, and their little family grew stronger each day. One evening, Luke sat with Emily on the back porch watching the sunset. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Dad?" she asked softly. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Do you think it'll ever stop feeling scary?" Luke kissed the top of her head. "Maybe not completely, but we'll face it together. Emily nodded, her fingers tracing the bracelet on her wrist. I like that. Luke smiled, holding her close. They had faced the darkness, and together they had found the light again. Luke remained on the porch long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. The night air carried the sound of crickets, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional murmur of laughter from inside the house. Through the warmly lit window, he could see Sarah and Clara clearing the dishes, while Emily sat at the kitchen table, her head bent over her sketchbook, completely lost in her drawing. It was such a simple, ordinary moment, yet it filled him with a deep, aching gratitude. After everything they had been through, after years of darkness, uncertainty, and grief, he was finally home. Diana stepped onto the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Luke before settling into the chair beside him. You should be inside with them, she said, nodding toward the window. Enjoying nights like these? Luke took a sip of the coffee, letting its warmth chase away the lingering chill in his chest. I know, he admitted. I just needed a minute. Diana studied him, her sharp eyes full of understanding. You don't have to keep carrying it, you know, she said softly. You did everything you could. You brought her home. Luke exhaled, staring at the dark outline of the trees in the distance. I know, but some part of me... He paused, searching for the right words. Some part of me is still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Diana nodded. That's normal. You've been in fight mode for 5 years. Learning how to live again, how to just be, it's going to take time. Luke ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of it all settle in his bones. I just want her to be okay, he admitted. She will be, Diana assured him. She's stronger than she knows. And she's got you. Luke let her words sink in. He had spent so long searching, so long fighting, that he wasn't sure he knew how to stop. But looking through that window, seeing Emily laugh at something Clara said, watching Sarah shake her head fondly as she wiped down the counter, maybe Diana was right. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for something to go wrong. He finished his coffee and stood. You staying? He asked. Diana shook her head. Nah, I just came by to check in. You don't need me hovering anymore. She gave him a small smile. Besides, I think you've got everything you need right in there. Luke followed her gaze to the window, where Emily had just looked up from her drawing, scanning the room for him. When she saw him outside, she smiled, a small but genuine curve of her lips that made his heart swell. I think you're right, he murmured. Diana patted his shoulder. Try to get some sleep, Callahan. Luke nodded as she walked off the porch and into the night. Taking one last deep breath of the cool air, he turned and stepped inside. Emily immediately perked up. Dad, look. She held up her sketchbook, showing him a beautifully detailed drawing of their house, complete with the big oak tree in the yard. But what caught his attention was the tiny figures on the porch. Him, Emily, Clara, and Sarah. Luke's throat tightened as he crouched beside her. That's amazing, sweetheart. Clara leaned over, studying the drawing. You made me taller than I really am, she pointed out. Emily smirked. Artistic license. Luke chuckled, ruffling Emily's hair as she giggled. Sarah walked over, resting a hand on his shoulder. Everything okay? She asked softly. Luke looked around the room, taking it all in. The warmth, the laughter, the feeling of finally being whole again. Yeah, he said, his voice steady. Everything's perfect. Later that night, after Clara had gone home with Sarah and Emily had fallen asleep, Luke sat by his daughter's bed, watching her breathe peacefully. It still amazed him that she was here, safe, home. He reached out, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She stirred slightly, her brow furrowing. Dad? She mumbled sleepily. I'm here, baby, he whispered. Emily let out a content sigh, turning onto her side. Love you. Luke swallowed past the lump in his throat. Love you too, sweetheart.